Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Tracy mentioned, you can enter some questions in our QA entry over there. We have a few questions that were submitted ahead of time, so we're going to dive into a few of those. JP's been entering those for us. But before we get too far along, we wanted to introduce the team that's on the call today. We have Mandy Walls, who's from our developer advocate team. She works with our community to develop solutions for both PagerDuty and Rundeck. As myself, the director of product for the Rundeck team. We have Greg Chase, who is our product marketing manager and man of all the words. JP and Adam and Dutch are all from our field engineering team. They get out there in the field and really understand all of the implementation nuances. And Greg Schuler today joined. He's our lead developer, architect, and was one of the original founders of Rundeck, actually. So we're lucky to have him as well. So that's who's on the call today. And I think before we get started, Greg Chase was going to tell us a little bit about Summit coming up.
Yes, so if you have not heard, speaking of events that we were describing before, we have really one of the biggest events ever in the history for Rundeck users, and that is our contribution as part of PagerDuty Summit. So PagerDuty Summit is an amazing virtual event covering real-time digital operations, both in the incident response, and now with Rundeck being a key part of this, we're covering all things automation for incident response and automating for improving service ownership, and you build it, you run it with automation. So we have so far, I'd say almost 10 different sessions, including content in the keynote, where we're going to be showcasing some customers that are doing some amazing things with Rundeck, both with PagerDuty and on their own. And we'll be also making some really exciting announcements about further and deeper integration between PagerDuty and Rundeck. So with that, let's go ahead and get on to our questions.
Great, we'll come back to this screen here, so you know who's chatting as we start to answer some questions. And I thought we'd start with just sort of a broad question. This came in our early ask list, and it was really an open-ended question of how can someone use Rundeck for overall automation. Rundeck is the leading automation tool for self-service operations. So some key use cases are around incident response automation, and we'll actually dive into a little bit more of that in a question we have coming up about ServiceNow, and we can also discuss some PagerDuty incident management use cases. But there's also service request automation. Rundeck is also widely used to do ETL work. So if you have data that needs to be moved around at scheduled times, and there's kind of the sort of quip or tagline, if you will, that if you can script it, Rundeck can do it, and subsequently Rundeck can share that safely with everyone else that might need to run that script. And that they don't need access to all the systems or all the servers. They'll just be able to run, that particular script. So the automation possibilities reach far and wide. And with that, we'll get into a few further questions that will make that statement a little bit clearer. So next question that I think we'll take a look at is, how can we use our existing tools of CI/CD? So how can Rundeck leverage a CI/CD process? And I believe Dutch is going to take this question for us today.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a pretty common question that we get with Rundeck in regards to, we use CI. A lot of times customers come to us and say, or candidates, prospects come to us and say, we're currently using a build tool, CI/CD tool like Jenkins, Circle CI, Travis, GoCD. There's many flavors of them out there to put automation in our organization. And since we're using these tools for automation, if we move some of that to Rundeck, what does that integration look like? And to really talk about, we kind of have to look at the history in terms of the DevOps movement and the tooling around that. Is roughly 10 years ago, a little bit longer now, actually 11, 12 years ago, when DevOps first came out, Jenkins was kind of the de facto, even though it was built for developers and made for building software projects, and actually came from Hudson originally. Had this ability to connect to servers and run scripts, and you could schedule jobs. So it initially kind of became, Jenkins specifically became the initial de facto tooling, even for DevOps automation beyond the build pipeline processes for software projects. Since it was a tool built for developers, as most CI/CD tools are, certain aspects of it didn't fit well with automation and DevOps, and that comes down to access. And this is kind of where Rundeck really plays a major role. Is anything that Rundeck touches and accesses in your infrastructure, it's going to always answer those questions: who, what, when, where, and how. And it's also coupled with some rich ACLs that you can fine tune and give users access to exactly what they need. Now, how does Rundeck integrate with CI/CD tools? There's a couple of different ways that we see, an integration happening. You can have Rundeck jobs that when somebody runs a Rundeck job, and there might be somebody you don't want to give access to your CI/CD tooling, you could give them access to a job in Rundeck that's going to reach out and target that API and build a project. Or one of the things that I've seen, especially with build tools, is where build tools are used as a single purpose to build a project, like a software project, but the build tool itself doesn't deploy, even though it does and can have that capability. Users are starting to use Rundeck to deploy artifacts to servers. And in that case, what you'll have is you'll have a job in Rundeck that might be connected to a artifact like Maven or Artifactory that pulls in versions. And you have a job in Rundeck that users could run to deploy the software, or you could have the build pipeline reach back out to Rundeck and trigger the job in Rundeck to handle that deployment as well. So you kind of get a job that's multi-purpose in with the pipeline automation, but users could also manually run that job if they needed to as well. And you get a lot more of those security constraints and access within Rundeck when you take that approach. So just to reiterate, there's a couple of steps. You can have Rundeck call jobs in a CI/CD tool, or you can come back and actually have that CI/CD tool integrate with Rundeck and run jobs within Rundeck. And it doesn't have to specifically be even a deployment job. It could be any job that you have in Rundeck. You might want to trigger something via a webhook to kick off a job that, some other task that you want to happen that's not part of the build pipeline. And so it really does give you, in a sense, a good separation of concerns, where your CI/CD tooling is specifically for building, and then Rundeck's used for accessing other servers and doing other things that can integrate into what you're doing as part of your build pipeline.
Great. Yeah. So curious, there's another question in the list about Ansible and how they could use configuration tools like Ansible. It sounds like those two things sort of fall, closely aligned. Can you talk a little bit about how Ansible would fit into that?
Yeah, definitely. So Ansible is a great, fantastic tool for building automation. And the one thing that I really like about Ansible is that Ansible itself, while it does give you that consistency and that reliability in your playbooks, that when you run them, what you expect to happen is going to always happen. But the really important thing is within Ansible specifically is that it describes your infrastructure, describes what's going on. If you're writing Ansible playbooks, and the same thing can apply to Puppet, Chef, and Salt as well. You bring on a new hire, you want them to know anything about what's happening in the infrastructure, they can read your playbooks, which is much, much easier than going into each server individually and just kind of trying to figure out what's happening. So it kind of documents that. Now, where does the integration with Rundeck come in with Ansible? And there might be several reasons why you would want to trigger Ansible within Rundeck. And you might be thinking, hey, I've got my Ansible playbooks, I just run them fine myself. But you might have these other processes that you do in your organization where you might run a playbook when a specific ticket's created. And it might revolve around, maybe you're using Ansible playbooks to deploy something, or using Ansible playbooks to create new servers or integrate in with EC2 or VMware. It could be a variety of different issues. But what happens in the case where you don't want to run those playbooks, or you always run the playbooks, but it would be really nice if you could delegate that to somebody else. And we find ourselves in a position as SREs or DevOps engineers that we don't want to necessarily give somebody this Ansible playbook repository to just do this one task, or maybe even have some users that are on Windows that can't run Ansible playbooks. You can integrate those playbooks directly into Rundeck with a job, that a user could potentially, just run a Rundeck job that's going to kick off an Ansible playbook. Now, behind the scenes, Rundeck actually isn't running your playbook directly. It's, Rundeck's not replacing the Ansible binary that's executing the run of that playbook. What you do when you create a Rundeck job using the Ansible plugins, you're essentially delegating control. Rundeck saying has an Ansible plugin that's going to run the Ansible playbook command to run those playbooks. And Rundeck actually interacts with a lot of the Ansible commands: Ansible playbook, the Ansible command itself, Ansible inventory. You can even use your Ansible inventory as a node source in Rundeck for when you write your job filters. And even the great thing about Ansible is it even has a dynamic inventory plugin that you can source nodes dynamically from EC2 or Azure or Google Cloud or VMware, and then through that dynamic inventory inside of Ansible, it works flawlessly with Rundeck. So we now have that inventory as nodes within Rundeck. But for the most part, automation with Ansible and Rundeck specifically comes down to writing a job that's going to run an Ansible playbook. You still have full control over your command line arguments that you would run from the command line, but you can also take advantage of Rundeck's key storage to keep your secrets in Rundeck's key storage, and also integrate that in with your playbook runs as well for controlling access to your remote nodes that Ansible might connect to.
Great. We'll shift back to a little bit more a broader question, and maybe we'll bug Greg Schuler for the long history on this. Wants to know a little bit more about the creation of projects and jobs, and the question is a bit open-ended right now, but I thought I'd add to it is, what was the original thinking, and what's the thought process around having projects and then jobs contained within projects for Rundeck? Why didn't we just create a big list of jobs?
Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. Basically, in Rundeck, you can have a set of nodes that you want to perform actions on, and then you can define jobs and the workflows that perform actions on those nodes. And so projects are a way of grouping those things together and carving out kind of independent groups of nodes and jobs that work on or that work independently. So projects just give you a space to have multiple sets of independent nodes, and then the jobs that execute on those nodes. That's kind of the higher view of what that organization is about.
And for Adam, Dutch, or JP, how do you see folks or customers in the field organizing their projects? Are they around departments? Are they around functional use? Like what are some of the strategies that customers are using to group those nodes and jobs, as Greg was saying?
That's an excellent question, and it's a little bit of both. We don't necessarily have or enforce a best practice of how jobs should be organized within projects themselves. At the end of the day, it really comes down with what you find beneficial. And you kind of hit the nail on the head for us that some organizations, they might organize projects or create projects based on functional teams, or they might create projects that group similar functionality together, or even projects that specifically may even exist. If you're some customers use Rundeck in a way as like an internal MSP, where other departments or might be the customers of the IT department, and those departments might have their own Rundeck projects. In terms of organizing jobs, the rule of thumb is, do what makes sense for you in your environment. And at the end of the day, the jobs themselves don't determine, or the projects themselves don't determine who has access to which jobs. You can fine tune, doesn't matter where your jobs live. Ultimately, your ACL is going to dictate, which user groups can have access to which jobs, no matter what project they're in. So it's a mix of both. Like I said, the best way of organizing your projects is to do it in a way that makes sense to you, and then use your ACLs to determine who has access. And the reason why I mentioned that is, when you give somebody access to a project, it's not all or nothing. We don't have these very basic access controls where, we're not in a situation where when you give a user access to a project, oh, this user's a job writer, this user's a job runner. That doesn't really exist. The ACLs that we write for those groups ultimately determine what jobs they have access to. So don't think of projects. I guess my best advice is don't think of projects as a way of controlling access. Just kind of think as projects of something that's a bucket to hold jobs. And at the end of the day, it really is up to you to determine, when you have a set of jobs, what's the best way to organize them? Do I put these in separate projects, or do I put them in the same project? Or do I base it on, certain user groups have access to certain projects? And like I said, at the end of the day, it's just what makes sense in your environment.
Great. Okay, so we'll go on to a few more questions that are open here. Tracy, remind me how much time we have?
We have the full hour, Forrest.
Awesome. Okay, great. Multi-cloud DR Playbooks. I see that, Henry Pan, I see that you've joined here. If you want to add any clarification, feel free to type that in chat or respond on the question there. But we'll kind of make a few assumptions. Multi-clouds, we can interact with AWS and Azure. Support for GCP and Oracle Cloud are coming soon. So we can write jobs and perform actions against those with enterprise plugins. And going back to my earlier comment, if you can script it, we can do it today. So we can interact with all the clouds. For the DR disaster recovery playbooks themselves, if you have playbooks today, or a process that you would want to follow today, that could definitely be worked into a Rundeck workflow and process. Not sure if there's any further clarification or things that we can. Oh, it looks like even Tracy, even you can come off mute and maybe add some more color to what you're curious about. Okay, well, if something comes to mind, or if you want to put something into chat, we can come back around to that. And there is another question that I can hopefully do a brief demonstration, or at least a walkthrough on how Rundeck works with ServiceNow. So let me drag this screen over. This is our instance of ServiceNow. Rundeck does have an application in the ServiceNow store that will sort of, it enables ServiceNow developers to very easily make calls to our webhooks. So let me take a step back. This is my Rundeck instance. And I have a variety of different types of projects that have webhooks configured in them. So these webhooks would do things like enhance tickets in PagerDuty, or if I come back to my ServiceNow examples, I have other webhooks here that would, populate information in a ticket. When we come back to the ServiceNow portion, after configuring the application very quickly with an API key and the URL of my Rundeck instance, I can then populate the webhooks into this table. And that's just done through a very simple scheduled script. But each of these entries corresponds to a webhook that's in my Rundeck instance. So if I take a look at, you'll see some of these same webhooks here. Here's the PagerDuty ones, etc. When I take a look inside of these, we've got some demographic information that we need in order to make the call to the webhook. But we also provide the code example. So this code is what could be used inside of a UI action if you want to add a button to a form, a business rule if you're going to just do something automated in the back end. The business rules are essentially like database triggers. An example, I'm hoping this is going to work because some other folks have been using this instance lately as well. But if we create a new incident and assign, I'm going to go off sharing for just 1 second, see if I can figure out what's going on with my screen here. Okay, are we back? You guys can see my screen again?
Yes, we can.
All right, well, we'll try that again. We'll create a new incident. We'll assign it a configuration item. I need my Nginx lab instance. And we'll just say that, Nginx is down. Once I save this incident, caller is. Once I save this incident, because I've given it a CI, we can see that now I've got a button up here called a restart Rundeck server, or there are these calls for Rundeck get uptime or get the top output. hopefully when I click this Rundeck get uptime, this is a UI action. It's going to make a call to that particular webhook, and it is supposed to populate this this field. So within ServiceNow, as with any ServiceNow instance, you can customize and create the the business flow and business process with all the forms as you see fit. Our application is absolutely just there to help enable anything you want to use Rundeck to to leverage and automate. With ServiceNow coming from the other direction, we do have a variety of ServiceNow, what I call kind of branded steps, in that we can run jobs to create, update incidents and change management information. Right, so I could use this to create a new ServiceNow incident. And we'll edit this to show you what the job looks like real quick. So this is the incident create, right? You can set the caller and the description, etc. There's a variety of other ServiceNow steps that are built in here. So that's the quick overview on ServiceNow. If you want to, if there are any other follow-up questions, again, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A section. And there's definitely longer versions of this type of demo that we can do.
Okay, thank you.
And it looks like the last question we have on the Q&A is how to configure Rundeck in a production environment. What is the necessary configuration to be able to use Rundeck in prod? And I guess I'll probably expand on that question a little bit, again, throwing it out to JP, Adam, and Dutch, who are in the field, is what are the key areas that are best practices, or what are the key areas that people maybe often stumble on that are important to remember as you set things up?
Yeah, so configuring it for production environments, by the way, it comes down to how you want to run your environments. Again, it's a up to you type of scenario. If you're running with the open source version, it's generally just that one instance of Rundeck running on a server, database server that you feel comfortable with, either Postgres, MySQL, MS SQL, and setting up on either Linux or Windows production server. If you're going with the enterprise, we always recommend you do a clustered version of Rundeck Enterprise, so you have a failover, which we allow with an automatic heartbeat. So if the job's running and the server fails, the other server is going to stop and pick that up. Again, it comes down to what your preference is on inside production, how much failover you want to make sure you have covered for.
Along those lines, one of the popular questions we get asked, when somebody's going to install Rundeck is, what database do you recommend? And it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in that question. Is we primarily use Rundeck and test Rundeck against MySQL 5.7, but Rundeck can work with a number of databases, including Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, Postgres, and MySQL. And at the end of the day, which database you run Rundeck against really comes down to what databases your organization is familiar with. And there's advantages to each database platform. We're not going to debate that here today, but if you're running Postgres, and if I told you need to run a SQL Server instance and you don't have anybody that has familiarity with it, that kind of gives you a little bit of a disadvantage. But if you're familiar with Postgres, I'd tell you run Rundeck on Postgres, because at the end of the day, managing and maintaining the database is just as important as the servers that run Rundeck, and getting things set up to do proper database backups and proper and maybe even proper disaster recovery tests with those backups. So at the end of the day, for a database, you're going to want to use something that you're familiar with. In a clustered Rundeck environment, you're going to need some form of a load balancer in front of Rundeck. And again, that really comes down to using something that you're familiar with. If you're on AWS, it might be ALB, or I personally like HA proxy, but you might want to use Nginx. But the key thing is, the reason why we put a load balancer in front of Rundeck, if you've got 2 Rundeck instances in your cluster, you want to be able to use both of those servers in terms of what you're putting users on to run jobs. I think that the key thing that a lot of people overlook when setting up their load balancer is the one thing that is required is sticky sessions have to be enabled. And there's a couple other settings that we have to do depending on whether or not if you're terminating SSL on your load balancer, but not on your Rundeck server, there's a couple of things we have to do around exported headers and setting exported proto specifically. But the key things at the end of the day for Rundeck Enterprise, kind of comes down to some type of a load balancer reverse proxy that's going to sit in front of multiple Rundeck instances, and then having a database that's on its own dedicated instance and not on one of the Rundeck servers. And ideally, the servers that you're dedicating to run your Rundeck jobs, you're going to want to keep those, whether it's a virtual machine or even hardware or a Docker container, you want that thing to just want to run Rundeck and not anything else.
The next question, I think maybe we'll see if Greg Schuler wants to answer this one. Can Rundeck keep a state between task executions and use it in a workflow? And Sergey was the original person that asked the ServiceNow question as well. So I'm not sure if this is tied to your ServiceNow use case, Sergey, or if this is just within Rundeck. But Greg or anyone want to?
It is kind of part of the same test case we are investigating to implement. Yeah, so we have some tasks to be get from ServiceNow, then processed by Rundeck, and there are some steps which involving like wait time for 10 minutes between executions. And then after 3 executions, we should decide, should we post this update to ServiceNow or that update? So depending on outcome. So this is kind of use case.
Yeah, there is a way to do this. It's inside each workflow. When you execute a job, there's a set of data, which is called the context data. And normally that just contains things like the input option values. So when you enter values in the options defined in the job, that data gets set into the context of the execution and it's passed through to each step in the workflow. You can add data into that context using what we call data capture. So for example, in your use case, if you're running some scripts or other tasks, and then you want to wait for some time and see the outcome of those or some other process, and then you want to use that to determine, what to do with ServiceNow, the way you might do that is in the scripts that you run, or once you wait for the outcome of some other process, you would have to echo that data from the script. And then when you set up your workflow, you can add a log filter to the step that would echo that output. And the log filter allows you to use a regular expression to capture some of the output from that script and store that in the data context. You can then use the values that you've stored in that data context to do other logic in like a subsequent script step, or if you're using Rundeck Enterprise, you can use, we have some conditionals that you can put onto steps if you use what we call the rule set workflow strategy. So you can have some steps that would execute only if some condition is met, such as the data value that you captured into the context matches a certain value. So those are some ways that you could capture that output and use that to keep that state. If you were talking about keeping state between different jobs, that's a bit more difficult. It would work with Rundeck job reference steps. So within a Rundeck workflow, you can call another job, and essentially what happens is Rundeck will execute the workflow of that other job within the context of this current job, and then at the end of that other job finishing, it continues along with the rest of the workflow in the current job. And there's a way to capture data in that child job and then have it exported into the parent job. If you want to capture data that way, it's another way to do that.
Okay, great.
And I think there is a new doc, correct me if I'm wrong, Forrest, but I think there's a new how-to doc being written, or maybe it's already in the Rundeck docs on describe some of the use cases around the data capture.
It's coming out along with our 3.4.0 release. But yeah, it is teed up and ready. and describes the various ways that the data is captured and covers some of the log filters, etc.
Mhm. Okay, thank you guys. And while online, so another question: how do you provide an environment for Python scripts to don't interfere between like different teams, between different jobs?
So if I understand the question, you're asking about running Python scripts. Are you saying you're sharing them with multiple teams?
Well, Rundeck is a shared environment, so some team could have some Python script which would require this packages. Another team will have another script which will require different set of packages, maybe the same name but different version. So it's usually coming to mind virtual environment, but how it could be implemented on Rundeck on the server.
Interesting.
I think for us, in terms of one common way of handling this is, when we run Python scripts, we've got two parts of it. One is a job step that might reach out to a remote server and run a Python script. But the other one is, I think it's what's being referred to here, is running Python scripts locally on the Rundeck server. And among Python developers, Python virtual environments are pretty common, because a Python virtual environment running on your system has the ability to have, store dependencies within that virtual environment. And two different virtual environments might have different dependencies based on the scripts that are being run there. And technically, the dependencies in those two different environments could be the same package, but different versions of those packages. So it kind of gives you a separation of concerns. And also Python virtual environments give you the ability to run older code but allow you to progress towards the future. And in terms of this, if I'm running a Rundeck job locally, that's going to run a script on the Rundeck server. Typically, we have what's called the local node executor. But in this case, and this is kind of in theory, but I think what would work would be the script-based node executor. And Greg might have some flavor around this as well. But with the script-based node executor, before, and the way that would be configured is, for a specific project, or it could be configured in a way that it's going to run a command that switches you to that Python virtual environment, so that when that job step runs, it's going to run in the context of that Python virtual environment. Greg, does that sound like that's something that's possible and feasible? Could you do it with the script-based node executor?
Yeah, that would be possible. I think that it sounds like in the case of like multiple versions of, say, Python, yeah, you would either have to have a mechanism to change the context when you run the local script, which you could do with the script-based node executor, or you would do it within your script that you write. Or if you already have a mechanism for doing it in a virtual, like in a Docker image or a virtual machine, you could just directly use that same mechanism and invoke that from Rundeck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because in our environment, we cannot use Docker, we cannot raise a virtual machine for this, but we are going to use a Rundeck server to run the scripts. So yeah, we are going to work on this probably with you guys on more detailed session. I'm from TD Bank, and yeah, I know we have some sessions planned on this. So we will decide how to do it.